So we're going to go through a series here on the wonderful country of South Africa, something which is very dear to my heart. I do visit this country frequently, and I love, love, love the energy that comes out of here. Hello, everybody. Welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Delighted that you have stopped by to visit this wine educational channel. We are going to do a multi-part series on this country. On this one, we are looking at the introductory series to South Africa, but we will go through key grape varieties. We will go through wine laws, regulations, styles, and the key wine regions across the Western Cape. We'll finally look at wine business and initiatives at the end of this. So in this series, the introductory series, we are looking at 4 parts. So history through climate and weather, grape growing, and geology. Part 2 through to 4 is only available on my e-learning portal. That's over at winewithjimmy.com. Okay, let's get rocking and rolling with South Africa. Really fantastic country with a real long history for what we would call a New World wine country. It's often actually classed as the oldest New World wine country. And it does have wine production going back a good 350 years or so. So it's fairly significant. Let's talk about the foundations of the Cape Colony to begin with. So first of all, this area was very influenced by the Dutch. Now, out of the European powers, the Dutch were very significant in terms of trade, mercantile fleets, and they were very quick to exploit big trade networks across the world. Of course, they had a military, but they had to contend with the likes of the French and, of course, the English. But the Dutch were big shippers. And, of course, this is important if you look at Holland, the Netherlands, and its location on the sea. Being mainly sort of flatlands and wetlands and marshlands, of course, they're going to take to the sea quite easily. Now, the Dutch East India Company, a fairly powerful company, establishes a refreshment station at the Cape in 1652, and really with one single aim, and that's to provide fresh food to the company's merchant fleet on their voyages around the spice route areas into India and the surrounding areas. But of course, it evolved into much more than that when the land was really recognized for what was available. The establishment of a trading station led to a flourishing wine industry and eventually, and then later to a birth of a nation. One of the key advantages of having a supply station here for the mercantile fleets, the ships, was that, of course, there was problems with scurvy on the ships, of course, a lot of issues with the teeth. And having refreshment stations established would be one way of bolstering the health of sailors and, of course, combating things like scurvy, for example. Okay, so we talked about the establishment here of the Cape Colony. In 1655, we have Jan van Riebeeck, who's the first commander of the Cape. He then plants a vineyard on the 2nd of February, 1659. And the first wine eventually is made from Cape grapes. There was a few unsuccessful attempts, let's say first, but eventually it was. And his famous phrase was, "Today, praise be to God, wine was made for the first time from Cape grapes." And of course, difficult to import wine at that time, relying on the ships which were coming from Europe, but of course less frequent. So of course the reliance really needed to happen with Cape Colony grapes, and that quickly flourished, of course. So as well as working to improve the anchorage at Table Bay and also building a fort for protection, Jan van Riebeeck really kind of worked on other things. One of the most important missions was to make it into a contained post capable of producing those fresh provisions, not only wine, but everything else as well. And we know that there's a significant apple production in the Cape today, lemons as well, amongst many other fruits and vegetables. So there was something called the Company Garden established by Jan van Riebeek, and that's where he planted vines for both table grapes and wine production. The initial cuttings that were sent out to him in 1654 originated from the Rheingau, but they failed. So they started to take cuttings from Bohemia, the Canary Islands, of course, which was a major stopping point en route down here, France, Germany, Spain as well. And those arrived in 1655 and were more successful, and included within this manifest, of course, were the likes of Stien or Chenin Blanc, which is the major variety today and has been for quite some time. But all well and good that we have this Dutch influence. We have the likes of these vines being produced, but where does the experience come from? Well, this is important as well here. So many people started to flee religious persecution, and certainly the Protestants of France after the 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Before that had guaranteed their rights, but unfortunately that fell away. 200,000 French Huguenots emigrated to countries such as Switzerland, Germany, England, America, and as far afield as South Africa, of course. Among the first Huguenots were the likes of Francois Villon, which became then Virchoan, which is an important wine name today, in 1671, Pierre Lefebvre in 1683, Jean de Long, the de Troyes brothers, Francois Guillaume, who arrived in 1686 as well. Here are the signatures. They've got de Villiers up here as well. You've got the list of the index of signatures as well of those that arrived. So we also have important emigration coming here of the skill of the labor. So what you'd find is that you would have skilled labor coming from France, but also places like Belgium as well, settling in the Cape of Good Hope, and comprising about 1/6 of the free burgher population, which was establishing here. And many of them, when they were listed on a manifest, they would have what their experience or their profession was, and many of them listed vineyard pruners. The name up here, like I mentioned, number one, de Villiers, that is exactly what happened here. The de Villiers brothers arrived in the Cape with a reputation for viticulture and enology, winemaking. And through the years, the de Villiers brothers planted more than 40,000 vines across the Cape. And as we mentioned, that stock came from places like the Canary Islands, Bohemia, France, Germany, and Spain. And among them were the likes of Muscat Blanc or Muscat Frontignan, which of course is important for Vin de Constance, things like Chenin Blanc and Semillon arriving in the Cape. What's next? Well, in 1685, the first governor of the Cape, of this flourishing Cape colony, this is the gentleman called Simon van der Stel. Okay, he built a land, he purchased land, built a house, and started to produce wine as well as other fruits and vegetables, and used land also for cattle farming. Now, the estate, of course, is what we know today as the Constantia estate. And following his death in 1712, the estate was actually broken up and sold into three parts. So you have Gruet Constantia, and then also Klein Constantia. And then the third one would be the Berglivit estate as well. Now, Simon van der Stel ensured that from the start, the French, Dutch, and German settlers were intermingled. And in fact, Dutch was the only spoken language in schools and church. So actually, within 2 generations, the French language was nearly all but lost, and so was German. And in fact, we have this formation of what today we call Afrikaans, and that link to the Dutch, of course. Now, the town of Stellenbosch, important to understand this because Simon van der Stel, Stellenbosch, that's the etymology of Stellenbosch, it's named after him, and also the Simmonsberg mountain, a part of Stellenbosch, again, has that etymology linked to Simon van der Stel. I'm moving now into around this time. So I want to talk around the estate because there's a very famous wine that becomes crafted from this estate, which is called Vin de Constance. So let's just put a bit of history about these pioneering estates within Constantia, for example. So Simon van der Stel's Constantia estate was about 900 morgen, which is a measurement of space, really comprising of most of the valley. He built quite a fine house surrounded by gardens, orchards, and about 7,000 vines were planted by 1709. Most of these were Steendraf, blue muscadel of Catalonia, and white muscadel grown here as well. Now, the estate falls into disrepair at the death of Simon van der Stel, and of course it gets separated as well. We have someone called Hendrik Klöter, and Hendrik Klöter Senior buys part of the neglected Constantia estate. He's an experienced Stellenbosch farmer. And he buys about 250 morgen, so about a quarter of the estate, just a little bit over at that time. And he does rather well, so well that, of course, eventually the estate becomes very well known across the world. It is in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, where Mrs. Jennings recommends a little bit of Constantia for its healing powers on a disappointed heart. And of course, Napoleon Bonaparte as well. While in exile, his final exile in St. Helena, remember his first exile was on the island of Elba, which he escaped and of course started to march upon Paris again. But here in St. Helena, he enjoys Vin de Constance daily, shipping over 30 bottles to the island every month. And he actually reportedly requests a glass of Vin de Constance on his deathbed, refusing all other food and drink. There are other discussions as well. I'll talk about the French poet Baudelaire a little bit later. Now, Henri Klöter dies. Constantia is further divided between his 2 sons. That's Jacob Pieter, who inherits the big Constantia, Groot Constantia, and then 22-year-old Johann Gerhard, who settles on the upper portion of the estate, already under vine, which is known as the small or little Constantia, Klein Constantia. And that is established in 1818. Now, we have the French poet Charles Baudelaire. He writes the famous poem called Les Fleurs de Mal, in which he compares Constantia wine to his lover's lips. More important literature linking Constantia, of course. Charles Dickens. He begins work on his final and unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which talks about Constantia wine as well. But unfortunately, the estate becomes very much difficult to manage due to the introduction of phylloxera into the Cape Colony. And it in fact ends the production. And for 120 years, Vin de Constance is not produced in the Cape. In enter Dougie Just in 1980. He buys Klein Constantia from Ian Austin, and he decides to revive the farm to its former winemaking glory with the help of likes of Professor Chris Orfer of Stellenbosch University, winemaker Ross Gower, and architect Gavi Fagan begin work in the new cellar. And the first vintage is released in 1986 of the modern day era of Klein Constantia. These wines are very widely praised. They make them on the old process methods. This is not in the botrytis method. This is in the drying or the passito method, I suppose. And it becomes, of course, one of the most famous sweet wines again in the New World, if not the world. So nice bit of history there about a really famous expression of wine. Now, we need to just discuss really the difficulty in a political sense of South Africa, the Cape Colony. The United Kingdom, Great Britain, comes into ownership of the Cape Colony, and not being brilliant winemakers start to significantly wreck the industry of South Africa. And of course, they start the Zulu Wars, they start two Boer Wars at the end of the 19th century, entering into the 21st century, which significantly impacts the Western Cape and other areas. Now, actually, by the really coming up to the First World War, Britain had really drained the Cape Colony so much that the wine industry was absolutely in disrepair. There was so much wine being produced and so little being paid for it that there was a significant discrepancy in the market. So you'll see many sources, but 87 million vines were producing about 55 million litres of wine, which was far too much for the market to handle. Apparently, you could walk through Stellenbosch and there would be just cases and cases of it because it was cheaper to leave the wine rather than try and sell it. So, I suppose if you were a student at that time with free wine everywhere, times may have been good for you. Now, the government recognised the issue here and had to call upon a rather powerful company at the time, which is the Cooperative of Wine Growers of South Africa, KWV. And these were brought in to kind of regulate and survive the industry. They were brought in 1918. They were given a 5-year plan, really, to replenish and fix the industry. The interesting thing, though, is that, in fact, the KWV quota system, the fixed quota system which came in, didn't last 5 years. It, in fact, lasted until 1990. So we're looking at the better part of 60, 70 years. And that really is important to think about. One company had a monopoly, in effect, at dominating one country. Now, of course, there are other growers making wine at this time, but within the quota system, and most grapes are actually being fed to KWV. And it really helped the industry initially, but then dominated the industry. Think about that. We love wine today for its diversity. This country had little diversity because there was one company's vision really managing the industry. Thankfully, it did end. It ended at the end of apartheid in 1990. KWV still operates today, but not as a cooperative, today as a single private company. And we have, by 2017, the situation of bulk wine, which is being destined for Spanish brandy production. It's being transformed with around 85% of wine grapes reaching the market for wine production. And previously, it was only about a third. So the domination of grape production was really, in the past, significantly for brandy production. And of course, they focused on mass cultivars, Chenin with Chardonnay and a Colombard, for example, mass cultivars. So we've discussed that kind of movement of history there. That really, the KWV era was 1918 to 1990. Within that, there is some experimentation happening. And here we have, in 1925, the story of Pinotage, which is a crossing, of course, a crossing of Cinsault and Pinot Noir. The story begins here. The creator is Professor Abraham Isaac Perrault, and there is a lovely picture of him. He creates Pinotage in 1925, and the story goes that it kind of got forgotten and then was eventually picked up. And 16 years later, in 1941, Charles Theron de Val produced the first barrel of Pinotage wine in Stellenbosch. The name appeared on a wine label for the first time in 1961 as the Lanzerac Pinotage from 1959. So this background of Perrault equipped him with a unique skill set. And after a professional stint in the Cape government, he decided to extend the range of grapes found in the region. And it sent Perrault on a scouting mission. He returned with 177 varietals. He became the first professor of viticulture at the University of Stellenbosch, later advancing to the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture. He joined KWV in 1927. Of course, that's where really most of the future at that time was held. And he gave a major contribution to wine at his stint within KWV. To this day, around 177 varietals still form a part of the collection at the Velgevallen Experimental Farm in the University of Stellenbosch. Moving to more modern times, of course, we mentioned that 1990 was the end of the monopoly, really, of KWV, and we see an emergence of small independent growers and estates from 1990 who can do their own thing. And like a phoenix from the flames, the shackles are also released and South Africa is born again. And that's the phase we're in now. We're in a golden age for South African wine. It really is quite exciting. You've got wines being produced from the Swartland down to Constantia, across to Stellenbosch, across to Bok River, down to Elgin, down to Hermanus, Algulas, all these areas. We find exquisite wines now being produced across the Western Cape. And we have a creation of WSET as well, which was originally the SAWSEA. I don't have the date exactly. Someone, if you can put it in the comment section for when the SAWC was established. Today we call it Wines of South Africa, and they really are excellent in promoting, marketing, regulating the industry that we have down in South Africa and connecting it to the world. That's how I get to enjoy so much South African wine. I work fairly closely with WSET and often visit the country with the wonderful people at WSET. Fantastic. Long history lesson there on the country of South Africa. I do hope that you have enjoyed it. If you do have any comments, questions, or concerns, of course, you can get in touch with me. Comment on this video below. Always great to hear from you. Please join me for part 2 on the climate and weather of South Africa. This will only be available, just like videos 3 and 4, to those of you that actually sign up to the Wine with Jimmy e-learning portal. That's over at winewithjimmy.com. And if you do find yourself in the UK, it would be lovely to actually share some South African wine with you. So come and join me for a class, a glass, or a bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.